Arrangement is one of those things that is so key and so fundamental in producing amazing music. And if you don't understand how to build compelling arrangements, then it really doesn't matter how much of a technical wizard you are as a producer. Your productions will still sound meh. So there is an arrangement technique I'm going to show you in this video that will almost certainly change how you go about making music if you apply it. One of the biggest ways that you can make better music is by having arrangements that have contrast. Now, contrast is a bit of a loaded word because in this case that I'm using it, it's actually related to several things. But if you can create arrangements that have contrast, you will make arrangements that sound more interesting to your listener. Now, one of the biggest mistakes that I see in productions is arrangements that are simply boring. They don't go anywhere interesting. Same sounds, same dynamics. No contrast. I mean, if there's no contrast, then why keep listening? If a song is simply repeating the same thing over and over, most listeners will skip and listen to something different, unless we are talking about genres that repetition is the goal, like ambient music. So let's actually define what I mean when I say contrast. Contrast is really all about something being different, right? So if verse 1 of a song is soft, then a very simple method of adding contrast would to make verse 2 loud. That would be dynamically adding contrast because we are simply using dynamics or volume to make something different. There is contrast because of volume, soft versus loud. And this is a theme. Verses. In most cases, you can identify if there is contrast by pitting one concept versus another. Soft versus loud, long versus short, percussive versus non-percussive, etc., etc. And we're going to dig into examples here. So another way is that verse 1 could be utilizing sustained and elongated rhythms where the chords are sustained like this. So verse 1 has now set the tone that it is elongated and sustained. So verse 2 would be a great place to add contrast by instead using the opposite of sustain, which is added rhythm. And we can actually do this by changing nothing but the articulation that the instrument is being played, like this. It's the exact same chords, but it sounds completely different because there is contrast. So if we put these side by side within the context of a song where verse 1 is sustained and then verse 2 is not sustained, it could sound like this. Let's assume this is verse 2 now. And that, my friends, is what we call contrast by articulation or rhythmic variation. Non-rhythmic versus rhythmic. And we can do this 100 different ways with different articulations. I could also use more of these arps instead of staccato. So instead of this, we could do... right? Or we could change the rhythmic pulse to be less staccato and more of an in-between sustained and in-between staccato. So there are all of these varying degrees, right? So my whole point is that by simply changing the articulation and the rhythmic pulse, we have immediately introduced musical contrast. Now there are obviously varying degrees of this, right? So we can add contrast within the same verse by starting sustained and then building into more contrast by adding volume or dynamics. So this isn't necessarily just verse 1 and verse 2, but it could also be within the same verse, right? We could change the rhythmic foundation or articulation and that would sound different. So let me actually show you within an actual production. This is one of my own productions. Without vocals, this is verse 1. And what you're gonna see here is in these first 4 bars right in here, we're gonna have sustain. And in these second 4 bars, we're gonna all of a sudden have percussion. So here how the contrast happens inside of the same verse. Pluck, rhythm. This is all within the exact same verse. We now have contrast from the first 4 bars to the second 4 bars. So now instead of zooming out and thinking verse 1 and verse 2 having contrast, we now have contrast within the context of a single verse, and this makes it more interesting to listen to. Like, what would you rather hear? Would you rather hear 8 bars of just that sustain stuff, or actually having the 4 bars sustain and then all of a sudden the 4 bars of that rhythmic contrast with the drums coming in, these plucked elements, the rhythmic contrast? And I think I know the answer to that, because in most cases, we're gonna wanna listen to the one with contrast. And again, all this is obviously dependent on the context. This is not a black and white point, right? This is a concept that you need to decide how to use within your own music. So think of your arrangement as a painter thinks of colors. Colors are used to introduce contrast. Black versus white, light versus dark, blue versus red. You get the idea. And we have all of these varying shades that are in between. So this isn't me saying do X, Y, Z and copy me. I'm instead trying to give you a conceptual idea of what you can do. The core of it is use contrast. If you have no contrast, then it makes it very difficult to really want to listen to more, right? I mean, do you want to listen to music that goes nowhere unique? It just sounds the same volume, articulation, same everything? And again, obviously, I think some of you may say this is genre dependent. I don't disagree, but even if you listen to like taiko or other somewhat more ambient styles of music, there's usually still contrast happening. It's just over a slower period of time. So think of it like this. We can modify this concept based on the genre, but nonetheless, whether you make pop, hip hop, or cinematic or rock music, this concept can fit within any style of music. It's just how you go about applying it that may be different. Again, not black and white, a concept. So in a rock track, for example, the contrast might be that you start with a boom, 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 palm muted guitar, right? And you might start that way in the verse. And you might open up to power chords in the chorus. Right? Don't mind me, doing this with my mouth, right? So this is rhythmic and articulation contrast. One is more held back and rhythmic, right? That verse, and the chorus would be wide open and sustained with power. Either way, that is actual contrast. You can utilize drums for contrast. In the example I just showed here, we have that verse 1 starts no drums, and then verse 1, kind of the second part of it, it does use drums, and that adds contrast. So for me personally, I like using stark contrast in my music. So let me show you what I mean in this same example. So if we start in verse 1, and then I skip ahead to the chorus. So verse 1, again, starts with this kind of, it's ethereal. But if we were to go to the chorus, here's the bar leading up to the chorus. Here's the contrast. Contrast, right? So 1 is more ethereal, and then we kind of get the plucky stuff, but then it opens wide up, right? It's a little bit of a different kind of rhythm. We're on a ride cymbal instead of a hi-hat cymbal. We have open articulations. The gang vocals add this contrast because you got these falsetto-y kind of airy vocal layers. The reverb, all of this is heavily contrasted from the verse. But then if we get into verse 2, we can skip ahead a little bit. We're gonna have that same feeling of verse 1, but this time we're gonna have drums, staccato pattern, more plucked elements, and it contrasts verse 1. Here we go. No bass, plucks, drums. Now we add the bass. This is all about adding contrast. Like that is everything I'm thinking about whenever I'm producing music and making music. I'm thinking, how can I add more contrast into my music? So I personally like music that is heavily differentiated from moment to moment. But this might be more than you prefer, because ultimately this does come down to creative decisions. How far do you want to go with this, right? The beauty of musical concepts like this is that you can take it where you want to take it. Maybe you slowly modify, slowly differentiate. Maybe you go all in on it and go hard. Or maybe you find some balance. You have contrast, but it's not too crazy. It's up to you, and that is the beauty. But if you're using the same sounds all the way through without changing articulation, and you're not changing anything, you're not adding any contrast, it's almost always going to make for a boring arrangement. Now, if you want to see how I actually built this arrangement, this whole production I just showed you, I'm doing our first ever live workshop tomorrow, Saturday, October 15th, 2022. I'll be breaking down this song from start to finish, how I made the arrangement, how I got a super quick mix on it. That sounds awesome. You get to ask questions along the way. I have a link in the description down below or right here for you to sign up. I hope to see you there, but if not, stay creative, my friends.